this idea of like, there's no marrying and giving in marriage in heaven, right? Going towards the end game for every human soul, right? At the end of the day, like desire for heterosexual sex is not actually God's end game for the human heart. It's not, like that, because that's actually not what's going to happen in heaven. I'm sorry. Well, not sorry, whatever, but like, it's not.
Welcome to Communion and Shalom.
In this podcast, we are exploring how the biblical and historic Christian faith can engage sexuality, ethnicity, culture, and our local communities as we pursue the flourishing of God's kingdom. Our goal is to engage these topics charitably and with nuance.
Welcome to Communion and Shalom. TJ and I are here today with our esteemed guests, Anna and Shannon. They are from Eden Invitation, co-founders, and we're just super jazzed to have you guys on. We had a little Communion Shalom Eden Invitation bonfire, or was it a bonfire?
Yeah,
fire?
I think. Yeah.
Okay. It was a great time together.
We burned some wood. It happened.
And just, super jazzed about the work you guys are doing and are eager to both learn from y'all and just share more about your work with our listeners. So thanks so much for joining.
Thank you. Thank you for having us.
Yeah.
I was going to say, I specifically wanted to invite you because Eden Invitation, I think, is one of the organizations I admire most on kind of talking about faith and sexuality. So I was telling David Frank, like, we need to get them on. We need to talk with them. We need to just help our audience to know about your work more. I think a lot of our audience are Protestants, and they should, I'm like, oh, you guys need to know what Eden Invitation is doing as sort of a Catholic brothers and sisters community, what they're kind of working on. And additionally, you're Minnesota-based now, which David Frank is that as well. So it's even easier to be neighbors in that regard geographically at this point.
Oh, yeah.
So yeah, I'm also happy to see you. Thank you for coming on.
So if y'all would first introduce yourselves just personally, where you're from, and then we'll later learn a little bit more about the beginning of Eden Invitation.
Yeah, so this is Anna talking here, and I am from Minnesota originally, actually. I grew up in the Twin Cities and then went away to college, came back to do some ministry work, and then lived in Milwaukee, Wisconsin for 10 years. And I was a high school teacher, and then that's actually where I met Shannon, and Eden Invitation started out of Milwaukee.
And this is Shannon talking now. You can tell by the strong Midwest accent oftentimes, which is funny because I'm actually from a Chicago suburb. But the further north I move, the worse my accent gets. So I went to school at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where I studied social welfare, minored in gender and women's studies, and entrepreneurship. Little did I know that would become very useful. And then I did ministry work with a few different organizations in the Catholic Church, the Evangelical Catholic, Bruce City Catholic, working as a college campus missionary. So that was a big passion of mine, just sharing the gospel, walking with people in discipleship. And again, that was where I met Anna, and Eden Invitation was born in Milwaukee.
So as Eden Invitation describes themselves as kind of meeting or like kind of, I don't know, keeping up with like culture's always shifting, and how is the church actually maintaining that conversation? Could you, just elaborate on like what ideas, what situations were prompting you to start Eden Invitation?
Initiated. Well, you initiated it. And
Yes.
You started it initially, and I responded. So you can go ahead.
Yeah, so for me, Eden Invitation, well, whatever it was at the time, I was in a place in life where I had left the high school where I was teaching, and I was just kind of discerning like what was next in my life, and really just like reflecting on like what am I good at? Like, what has God used in the past? Where might he be calling me next? And I think, so for me, I started noticing attraction to women when I was in high school. And that was always something that had been a sticking point for me, especially working in youth ministry and teaching high school religion, and just realizing that the way that we talked about sexuality as a church just had a lot of room to grow. Resources were really limited, and I felt like the conversation, at least in the Church of the United States, seemed really dominated by culture war narratives, very us versus them, just really loaded. And that wasn't helpful to me as somebody with those experiences. And I saw that it wasn't helpful to people that I loved. And so that was kind of where my own prayer landed, was at first wanting to like speak and write and be more in kind of the thought space, right? But then in sharing this discernment with some friends of mine, one of those friends was Shannon. And then once Shannon kind of came into the conversations more, the conversation shifted from like, what are the ideas we need to get across? And like, what do people need to belong? Like, what do people need in their lives practically to maintain a life of faith and just like be joyful, be happy, like be alive at that intersection of faith and sexuality? And so Eden Invitation became not just about ideas, I think, but also about drawing people together in community. So we do a lot of small groups, we do retreats, we have local groups that are starting. Yeah, so it's kind of a both and.
And I think with that, I'll just add a little note too, that a part of it, I think the impetus as well was, some of this was stirring on my own heart too. When I was a missionary, I'd be like showing up at like the campus LGBT resource center or like women's center, just to like make sure that dialogue and those like opportunities for connection were still happening. Because I think too, I know at least a lot of what you've talked about is some of your impetus was wanting to see a just pastoral response. I think because of not necessarily having a diversity of resources, but also too, I think some of a just pastoral response includes community and includes what a yes to this like call and a yes to like living a side B life can really look like, not just no's or a list of no's. So that was, I think, a big conviction in starting it. And also too, I know for myself, just that sense of wanting people to know that they were good. I think in light of what you were saying, some of the intensity culture war piece that was around it is, I think there's just a lot of hiding that happens and shame. And so just wanting people to know that they're good and to like live that in community.
I'm curious, as of now, what do you see as Eden Invitation's like distinctives as an organization in this space on faith and sexuality? Maybe in the Catholic Church as well, particularly. I'm not sure how you want to approach that question. But
Yeah, I think in general, the approach that we try to take is actually one that I think is really rooted in, frankly, it's actually rooted in like mystical theology. It's basically saying like, okay, it's looking at this understanding that like, when we have desires, St. Thomas Aquinas would say that like, when we have desires, like, they, like, even if they're for something that's sinful, like, there's still, like, a seed of good that's there. Like, we wouldn't want something if there wasn't something there that was good. And so when we look at, same-sex attraction specifically, but I think there's also corollaries here for gender disconnect, like, when we're desiring, even if it's, like, desiring something sexual with somebody of the same sex, like, the reality is, like, the perfection, like, as man and women, like made in the image and likeness of God, like the perfection of the masculine, the perfection of the feminine is in God's heart, right? And so that even in those places that can be challenging for us, I think, living a side B life, like there are ways in which like God wants to encounter us in those places of desire and in those places of longing, and to not be afraid of that and to be in touch with that and to see that as an avenue for encountering the Lord. And so I think that's because I think there's a lot of places that are like, oh, we're doing small groups or we're doing conversations or we do retreats, I think what binds a lot of the Eden Invitation community together is we're really committed to kind of like stepping into that longing together in community, like that spirituality that really comes through what we do, I think makes us really unique. And then I think in the Catholic space, we're really the only one that's not led by priests. So there's another big ministry that's led by priests. But this one is just kind of like the everyday people in the pews. Here we are, just like trying to be together and help each other out and grow. And so that makes it, I think, really accessible to a lot of different people, no matter their Christian denomination, right? Like there's, that we're kind of just like in all this together as peers.
Yes. And I think with that too, I think oftentimes people who experience same-sex desires, gender discordance, you can often feel like you're the subject of ministry and don't always know your place in ministry, right? In leading it and being able to be open about your experience. And just with that, I think that was part of it with your point of everyday people in the pews. Like, we wanted to see keynote speakers with our own experiences, you know, because that just makes a world of a difference to connect with someone.
And so, like, on your, you have such a large emphasis on community, which is a desperate need in our age. How, I mean, well, you were coming from a teacher background more so, you were coming from a, like, discipleship background. How do you think of, like, is catechesis or curriculums or, like, discipleship? Like, do you have, like, I don't know, program agendas, or you said, like, oh, we have these ideas, but we realized such a need was community. How do these things mesh together?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think, like, we definitely have, I'm the teacher background, right? So we have, like, formation pillars and things like that. And definitely when we get together, right, when we have, like, our small groups, like, either we're doing a book that's already established, like, oh, we're reading this book together, or, like, I've also kind of created, like, a mini curriculum, right? Like, we're doing a topic, like, we did one on discernment. So I drew from a bunch of different texts and we were reading different things and having discussion groups around it. I've also written stuff from scratch that we've used, you know, about Eden Temptation's values and some other, like, theological concepts. And then usually our retreats are themed as well, right? So we'll have a particular theme, or we'll try to cover different topics. Like, we did a retreat that was primarily about community, for example. And so there was a bunch of different talks and breakout sessions all centered around those themes.
And I just wanted to add to that too, with your piece about community, or your question about community. I think such a big part of community is the concept of incarnation. And not only, like, with the ideas piece and the formation we do, that we try to, like, walk through some of those questions in our content, but we try to be really intentional with, like, literally the incarnate activities we do, especially, again, so much of this experience is around the body in a lot of ways, that we've been really keen on wanting to, like, introduce a sense of just, like, incarnate ritual and, like, celebration. So a big thing we do is, like, we do toasts of celebration where we can honor, just kind of like imaging the wedding feast of the Lamb, right? Of, like, what we're moving towards together. We like to do toasts as a community very often, so that you can actually, like, cheers to something and celebrate life, you know, and to say that this is the cup of my life and I want to live this and I want to live this together. Or even to a big thing we do, like, on our retreats, is we do a renewal of our baptismal vows, right? People might not know, like, are you going to say vows in your life to another person necessarily? And so how can we actually live the, like, incarnate sense of our bodies too, around an area that's such a question around embodiment? How can we do that in community? And so that's another big piece, I think, that goes beyond curriculum and programs, so to speak. It's how do we live the incarnation together and make commitments as a community?
It's beautiful. I was already really wanting to go on your guys' retreat this fall.
Yeah, me too.
I'm like, you know, maybe a prayer of faith can move mountains and make it happen for me.
We still have a few spots.
I might
And maybe
contact
scholarships.
you. I might contact you.
Maybe not by the time this airs, so
Yeah, you sorry, listeners.
Yeah, you guys will have to wait till the next year.
Yeah, true. I was going to ask, so I got a little bit of this vision from what Shannon just shared particularly, but what are your goals for the participants of your community, your programming? Like, most of them are probably same-sex attracted, LGBT, queer, whatever. Yeah, so what are you hoping for through their participation as the leaders of this ministry or organization?
I hope that people would be holy and have hope for their lives. I think a lot of the time, you know, when you have an LGBTQ experience in the church, like, the future is foggy, right? Companionship is foggy. Vocation is foggy and can feel like a lot of closed doors or a lot of no's, like we've already been talking about.
Yeah.
And I think it's not always easy to see a pathway forward for yourself, especially as a younger person, right? I think, you know, Shannon and I are both in our 30s, and, like, when you see, you get into your mid to late 20s and you watch all your friends like kind of go off on their own journeys in more prescripted ways, right?
Yeah.
By our churches. And you just can kind of feel lost. And I think more than just reconciling this experience with God, because I think that's the first thing you need to do, I think the baseline goal is like reconciling your queer experience with God, finding other people to support you, right, in moving in this direction of discipleship towards heaven, right? And also like having a hope for your future and taking proactive steps into that future, right? That God has a creative calling for your life, to believe that for yourself and to have the tools to step into that, day in and day out and continue to mature in your life of faith.
Have you had participation of those in your community who are, maybe there's like sexual experiences more traditionally heterosexual, but either they've committed themselves to like vocational celibacy or have unwanted celibacy, and so some of this still work of like, well, how do I take my unmet sexual, longings and in the ways that you're talking about, kind of this mystical rooting? Has that been a source for other folks?
I would say per like the description, not necessarily the particulars of like in community events, but actually I know you've named this, Anna, that like there's a lot of resonance, I think, for people who perhaps they don't have an LGBT plus experience, but they resonate a lot because of some sense of tapping into that longing, or perhaps the sense of like finding themselves in a funky place with celibacy and being like, okay, so what does this mean for my life? So, I mean, you can answer that more,
Yeah,
but I know you've said people really deeply resonate.
Yeah, I mean, we've had people reach out who, so in the Catholic Church, if you get divorced, there's just some more things you have to go through if you want to get remarried, and some people can't remarry. Or couples that are infertile. And I feel like we've had people, again, that have kind of like come up against these longings in their hearts and in their lives, and yeah, really resonating with what we're talking about, And so right now, the community, the ministry we do is strictly LGBTQ plus, but we've seen a wider reach, specifically through like writing and speaking, or people that have kind of stumbled across our website.
Yeah. Who've been like big supporters too, I think, in light of that.
TJ and I,
These are you.
I was just saying, we met some volunteers at the first Revoice who were going to church there, and it was a husband and wife who were helping out, and the husband was just like, they need a Revoice for straight people. This stuff is excellent. Like,
because I think so often, like in our churches, it's like this concept that like marriage is going to complete you, right? That marriage is the existential answer, and that's just not the case. Right? And that's not actually what God says either. Specifically in heaven, there will be no marrying or giving in marriage.
That's true.
So yes, marriage is a good here and now, but shouldn't you also, isn't there like a part of your heart that God maybe wants to like prepare for that future eternity, like for him in a particular way? Yeah. So I don't know, maybe sometimes on some days I feel kind of lucky, that's not every day, but some days it's like, okay, God, like, my life is a prefigurement of what every person will be called to someday.
Yes, and that's actually something I wanted to bounce off of too. Something that I just think is really interesting. I think there really can be a prophetic witness that, side B and just people with LGBT plus experiences, I think trying to walk this life is, I feel like the question around sexuality and gender is, in some ways, we come up against one of the first missional commands in Genesis, like immediately, right? Like to be fruitful and multiply. And I think there's something to that like we just have to face that question really readily. I think when you are like choosing, or when you're wrestling with your faith, or you're choosing to pursue it, that you really do face that missional command, right? In different ways, and have to ask like, well, how will my life be fruitful? What will my life look like in ways that happens, I think, earlier than perhaps some people who may not face that question right away. And so I think to your point of like some people being like, wait, we could use this, that it's like, it's actually, these are questions we all have to face at some point in our lives. But I do think there's a uniqueness sometimes to the LGBT plus experience that kind of pushes you to face them a lot sooner, entering into your faith or pressing into your faith.
And there's a friend who I think was kind of, leaning in as kind of an ally and, but then kind of theologically it was like, well, wait, is the LGBTQ communities or those with same-sex attraction, is their sexuality more disordered or messed up or sinful than my sexuality? And they didn't know. I was trying to help them like nuance through the different answers, bouncing off that towards what does the Catholic tradition bring to this conversation of faith and sexuality, and maybe particularly starting with maybe answering that. How do we think about same-sex versus opposite-sex desires differently?
Yeah, I think actually, at least from our perspective, I would actually like dial it back even further from just sexuality, because at least, so within the Catholic tradition, when we use the word disordered, we specifically mean it has nothing to do with psychology. It has, nothing to do with like Marie Kondo and your cluttered house. Like it's a philosophical term that specifically is referring to like something that's not like ordered or moving towards its like proper end, right? What God intended this for. And so that word would get applied to any type of sin at all, or any type of desire for a behavior that is sinful. So if you look in like the Catholic Catechism, it's like, so examples of disorder, right? Yes, like homosexual acts are listed as something that is, a disorder, desire. But so is like gossip. Thoughtless chatter is one of them. I don't even know what that is, but it's like apparently disordered. Like you have to be intentional in how you speak, right? And so I like love showing that stuff to straight people because I'm like, you're disordered. We're all disordered, right? Like we all desire things that aren't like the perfection of what God wanted for us, right? And so actually, when it comes to like heterosexual desire, like heterosexual lust would be considered disordered. Like if you're desiring to have sex with somebody that is not your spouse, or with your spouse in a way that is not like truly loving, within this understanding of the word disordered, that would be called disordered. That would be called a disordered desire. And so, they're different in the sense that they're four different things, but there's not like a difference in kind or degree even necessarily, right? It's more a difference in the object, but all of it would be considered like, no, this isn't what God made us for. And so that's problematic.
It seems like that to my outsider perspective, but I'm Anglican, so kind of mixed, a little bit mixed in the outsider-insider perspective, but whatever. It seems like one of the strengths of the Catholic theological tradition is it already has a philosophical framework to understand some of these questions in a way that, like a lot of Protestantism, for example, because of their sort of biblicism, their like extreme focus on the Bible, they had a harder time sometimes building frameworks to understand it beyond just appeal to like particular verses. Like it says this, but then that can different ways of interpreting can easily make that just look at the Bible like complex, like that appeal to the Bible complex. So are there any other kind of strengths that you see in that Catholic tradition in engaging these topics particularly?
I think another strength is we have a really robust tradition of celibacy, right? Obviously, there's clerical celibacy that's expected for all priests. But even beyond that, there's religious communities, monastic communities, people that all commit to a life of celibacy in their living community and charitable works together. Also a tradition of people, it's actually we'd call it consecrated virginity. So there's like a special blessing for somebody who remains in the world, doing their job, living their life, but they are particularly consecrated to God alone, right? And so I think that it's still hard, right? It's still challenging when you're like, well, I feel like straight people get to pick and choose between all these options, and mine get a lot narrower. But at least it's not like strange. You know?
Sure.
Like, and there's a lot of resources I think that can be applicable if you're living, you know, kind of vocational celibacy, so to speak, in the world, that you can still draw from some of those religious or monastic resources. They're still applicable. And so to have that body of work, I think, to draw from is really valuable just in daily living.
Yeah. May I ask you, in a normal Catholic parish, do you know many celibates or singles, like in a normal parish? I ask because in Protestant churches that I've attended, there's usually very few, if any. So
it depends.
Mixed bag.
Mixed bag.
I was going to say, I feel like among young people, there tends to be a little bit of trend of like the like classic, like hunting for your spouse vibe.
Yeah, sure.
And so I think it can be really isolating for young queer people, you know, when that's all they see, or that's what it feels like most events are for. And I think even too, I know there's like layers, at least in my home parishes, where like there were an older single person, people were always like, oh, what's their deal? But I do think that there has been more of a movement for this being a little more common again. I think there was an older tradition of, I think, like a lot more dynamic options for like celibacy in the Catholic tradition. And there was like a run where it was a lot of pressing in on like marriage, priestly vocations, and religious life. But I would say I think you're seeing more of a movement towards people leaning into like the celibate single life.
And I can think of, just right off the top of my head, like 3 friends of mine kind of in a pretty good like inner circle who are professing heterosexuals who have chosen and made some kind of vow or commitment to be single, you know, and to be celibate. And so, yeah, and not just, you know, they don't all like live in the same place or go to the same church, but they exist. And not to mention all the people that have LGBTQ plus experiences that I know, right? But even just within that space. So I think at the average church, it's like probably a mixed bag and probably people from a lot of different backgrounds. But yeah, to Shannon's point, I think it's getting increasingly discussed and kind of held out as like, hey, this could be something that God could call you to.
It's not just that random older person, you know, that like there's a lot more to it.
I get that. In Eden Invitation, are there a lot of people who are considering consecrated virginhood, I guess, as a path, or virginity, consecrated virginity as a path?
Yeah, I think there's definitely some, or people, looking for a way to commit themselves, right? That's a particular right. I mean, that's a very particular thing, a particular right in the church.
But we know a lot of people who will look to do more like private vows, but to make a specific commitment.
Yeah, I think what we're seeing is there's a lot of people who, whether their attraction is exclusive, or maybe it's not an exclusive attraction to the same sex, but they're like, my experience of sexuality has put me on this path of being open to more than I was open to before, right? So maybe they're still attracted to the opposite sex to some degree, but it's like, it's not just about that. It's about this opened my eyes to what God might be calling me to. So I would say, I think that most people in Eden Invitation who have an exclusive attraction for sure are like considering what could I do to like show a commitment to this and like do more, like do something concrete besides just like, well, I guess I'm stuck with this. Yeah. Do I want cats or dogs? Do I have roommates or not? What do I do? House plants? Am I a succulent person? You know, like I think there's something bigger that I think it's kind of new and it's fresh. I mean, Eden Invitation itself has only been around. We're in our 7th year, but yeah, I see a lot of those considerations at least.
Yeah, and I think that's something just to build off of that, something I think we've really tried to press on. One of our values is joyful hope, and kind of getting into a little bit more of like what could the creativity of your yes and your self-gift look like. And so I think there's something really cool that we're seeing is people just being open to creative possibility, and just the ways in which like how can you actually be really creative with your gift, or your life, the gift of your life, in ways that perhaps like you never anticipated, or that are needed. And so I think that's just been really fun too to see as people have grown more comfortable or wanting to draw in or enter into a little bit more of a commitment, just seeing the ways in which they want to be creative with their celibacy and self-gift.
We recently did an interview with a new friend named Marco Casanova of Desert Stream. Is that right? You know him. We were trying to engage many perspectives on the podcast, basically. And it's funny because you and he use similar language, but you come to some fairly different ends of fairly different conclusions from that, even though he's Catholic as well, so you're both in the same theological tradition.
He was really emphasizing coming to terms with the fact that he, this kind of self-gift, that like, oh no, I am a gift as a man. And while he, had no qualms with people, he's Catholic, and so like towards committed celibacy and such, for him, it was coming to discover in marriage the way that he can be a gift towards a woman, despite it having kind of a gay determinism earlier on in his life.
I will say, like, I definitely don't want to make it seem like everyone in Eden Invitation is like is single either. I mean, I think we have a large number of bisexual people too who are exploring, dating and marriage in the midst of that. Because I also think there can be a stigma that like, oh, if you experience any degree of same-sex attraction, you shouldn't get married, right? That this like disqualifies you or invalidates a marriage in some way. And that's just like not necessarily the case. And so I think we also try to encourage people who are attracted to both sexes, right? To say like, okay, like, where's, what does God have for you?
But I also think too with that, like people who are in mixed orientation marriages or married to the opposite sex, that like, I think that's again part of our thing with the mysticism. It's that like being married doesn't mean that goes away. Being married doesn't mean your same-sex desires go away. And so I think that's why some of those people who are bisexual or married are drawn to it though too, is like, so you're like showing a direction of like, how do I like surrender this to the Lord or like invite God into this experience of longing that might still exist in my life.
And to recognize that like this call to self-gift is actually, it's a broad call, right? It's a human call. And so the gift of self, even in marriage, it's not just concentrated, right, on just the spouse or just the spouse and kids, right? But that to live as a gift of self affects your whole community. I think that's important.
And creation. I just am thinking, Eden Invitation, got to bring it in. Yeah. But you think of Genesis and like part of Adam's gift of self was like naming the animals and like cultivating the land. And so like that predates the like companionship and the be fruitful and multiply, right? And so that there's a self gift that even comes before that too.
Yeah, sure.
So has Eden Invitation got a community garden in its plans?
Oh, love it.
If we ever have a commune, I'm sure growing our own food will be part of it.
Where all the local hearth groups exist.
You start it, I'll help fill it.
He would help you, yes. I wanted to ask you, could you comment or talk about your relationship to these other sort of Catholic, typically, groups who are talking about faith and sexuality? One big one is Courage. But of course, there might be other ones. As I mentioned, Marco Casanova, Desert Stream is not Catholic, but he's Catholic, and he talks he uses Catholic reflection to talk about his perspectives. Yeah, would you comment on how you guys relate to these other groups?
Yeah, I mean, I think when it comes to these areas of like ministry, right? There's no scarcity of people in our world today that like need to encounter the Lord in the midst of their LGBTQ plus experience. And I think there are, different groups, we respond, I think, in different ways, in different tones, from different spiritual backgrounds. And something you might notice too, I think, is that, even within the Catholic space, like, there's doctrine, but there's also different spiritualities, right? There's areas of focus. We see this in religious orders like Franciscan, Dominican, and that kind of a thing. But I think we also can see it, these different areas of emphasis that happen with some of these other ministries, right? So courage, for example, that you mentioned is, it's kind of like a ministry of the priesthood, right? So each group, there's a spiritual father who's running the meeting. It's also a bit more accountability focused, or accountability around kind of like acting out sexually is maybe how they would phrase it. And so that's a particular model, right? So there's some different models or areas of focus, right? So Eden Imitation, again, we're more peer-led. We're kind of more from a discipleship background. So we're focused on, that's more of our approach, right? And I think those are the only two that are distinctly and specifically Catholic.
I see.
This population.
I see. That's helpful. Kind of moving, this is on a pretty different topic, but I've always been interested to ask you, as a lot in like the side B space more generally, typically men are more present. Typically, a lot of times men are leading or like the most visible kind of people on the stage or at the podium or at the pulpit or whatever. What has it been like being women leading this conversation when there's a lot of men around who are, the leaders essentially, or the most visible population in the conversation? So
it's funny because I didn't notice that when we first started. Like, I just was like head down. No, like I
was like, let's go.
Head down, let's do this. And then there was like a little bit of time passed, and we started to realize, like, okay, sometimes you need introductions through men, or like people just assumed that we were only a women's ministry. Like that was the biggest thing we got. We're like, oh yeah, so you serve women, right? And we're like, we serve everyone. Like, in that sense, like, come on. That's a big thing. I think a lot of people assume when women run a ministry, it's just for women. But I do think, and especially too, in a church where clergy, like the hierarchy of the church with clergy and stuff, like that's extremely prominent, But laity, we also have a tradition in the church of the laity, like lay people.
People in the pews.
Not ladies. People in the pews, that there is also like a rich tradition of the laity really like carrying out the mission of the church in the world in really practical ways. And so I think that's probably why we felt really empowered from the get-go. But I do think you can build off of this. But I do think that there are just some hurdles we've had to jump through in light of that. I think because of some of those assumptions, or because that is just like, it is less common for women to be like leading up front in ministries.
Yeah. And I think the only other thing I'd add is that I think the longer we're around, like the less female peers we have, because I think a lot of women end up, I'm going to stay with my kids now, or I'm going part-time. And so there are less, I think, women leaders in ministry for that reason. I feel really blessed, though. I think we've been around long enough now that we know some of those other players and have gotten some really good fellowship with other female ministry leaders. So I don't necessarily feel it as a pain point in ways that we maybe did earlier on.
And I think too, we've been around almost 7 years. And so I think even too, some of those spaces perhaps where it felt like we had to like claim our space a little bit more, I think we are in a space where we can show up into a meeting that's predominantly male and like be able to bear witness to our mission in a way that is like respected. Because we've been at this for 7 years now, and so I think that's a part of it too.
This is a question that often comes up in some of these conversations, at least for some people. I want to ask about the language question around LGBTQ plus language, queer, et cetera, et cetera. Obviously, in this conversation we've had together, we've used, I think, the whole gamut, basically, of most of the language terms that could be used in English. But, what has it been like for you in your ministry to engage this question? Just because it's often a trigger point for usually critics of, you might say side B, or you might say like more engaged, like, I don't know, contextually engaged sort of people in the conversation. What has that been like for you guys?
I understand a lot of the loaded nature around language. And I think it's been loaded in a lot of directions, right? I mean, you think of, and I'm not trying to like be crass or anything, but you think of like for a long time, the common term was like sodomy laws, you know, and that's obviously deeply offensive, but was considered super normative. And then you have people with these experiences reacting against that, right? And now the language shifts, right? And you also had for a long time, like homosexual was kind of the buzzword. And now that's gone a little bit the way of the dinosaur.
Even integrated in the DSM.
Yeah.
Like, you know,
Mm-hmm.
Right. And that's also in the Catholic Catechism. That's the term that's used. But that term was coined by like an activist 100 years ago to like normalize these behaviors. So you're like, wait, but we can use that word? You know, it's just I feel like the language question is just kind of odd to me. And I understand that obviously in the 70s and 80s, this was, you know, a lot of the terms that got stressed today, right? Gay, lesbian, they get kind of bound up in particular, you know, socio-political agendas. And so then now people are suspicious of those terms. But I think to me, if you look at history, it seems like we just have this revolving door in some ways of terminology. And I almost wonder if that is a bit of a red herring or if we're really picking the right battle territory culturally sometimes around language. And so I think within Eden Invitation, we are pretty like loose-handed about the terms that the adjectives people use to describe, right? Because I think there's a lot of loaded adjectives in the world today, right? It's like, I'm sure there are a lot of people, like the term American, to even call myself an American is a loaded term globally that also has associations with immoral behavior on a national scale.
Yeah, it does.
You know? And so like, should I be self-identifying as that? Like why that could be problematic. And so I think all adjectives we need to take with a grain of salt. And really at the end of the day, it's like, how do I view myself in relation to God first and foremost, right? Like as his child. Like, am I a human being, like created with dignity, who is his child that, has that, and what adjectives am I using to describe parts of me? Like if that understanding is prior, I'm less concerned about what comes after.
And I think too, that's one of the things that's challenging about the language debate that stirs up is I feel like, to your point with the red herring, that it's not drawing people to encountering Christ first and trying to like meet the Lord in it first, rather than just trying to point. Again, I think it can be a distraction often, rather than actually trying to draw people into community and communion, like in that sense.
Is this still a really charged question among like the Catholic parishes that you guys are part of, the language question?
100% it is.
Okay.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Things written about it. Yeah, there's a lot.
Okay. Yeah. Got it. But I assume at invitation events, I assume you let people use whatever language they feel so inclined to use. You don't police it in that way.
Yeah,
I don't know.
That's the route we've always gone, is use what language you're most comfortable with. This was always the little shtick. It was use what language you're most comfortable with, so long as it's not like explicitly derogatory and you're forcing it upon someone else. And we'd always say too that like just because someone uses gay or struggle with same-sex attraction, like you can't make certain assumptions of what all that means, right?
Got it.
Like that they see the entire experience as a cross, or that they're exercising certain behaviors, you know? And I think we've tried to like take the air out of it a bit more, of being like, yep, this is just how you're describing, and that's how you are particularly using that description. I think we often use the language of like same-sex desires or gender discordance, or we'll say like within it, for people like or disciples who have an LGBT plus experience, for like shorthand. So that tends to be kind of like our go-tos when we're talking.
I kind of, LGBTQ experience feels both like inviting in the cultural conversation while helping those who are very worried about how you're like defining your anthropology. I'd be like, I'm not describing my personhood, I'm describing my experiences. But to make maybe a more charged question, just bouncing off of our recent interviews with other folks, some of the concerns both is like, how are you properly identifying? But is on this really the concept of just sexual orientation, and like, is that putting ourselves in like kind of a deterministic framework, or like over prioritizing whatever kind of current experiences of attractions in such a way that is maybe letting them be more fixed and not using, kind of putting myself in other language of like not letting you, because you talk about like, we want to pursue Jesus, and they'd say, yeah, so let him heal whatever brokenness you have in your sexual orientation. How do you guys process through that perspective?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that, so, my interpretation of a Catholic framework is that, so within the Catholic Catechism, it does say that like the psychological genesis of same-sex desires is, quote, largely unexplained. And there's really nothing in there at all about increase, decrease. There's really just recommendations to pray and receive the sacraments and have friends and recognize that like this needs to be united with the Paschal mystery of Jesus, right? Like his like cross and resurrection. And also we believe that in baptism, the tendency to sin, concupiscence, right? You're cleansed of original sin, but the tendency to desire sin like still remains in us, right? And there's really not a lot of specifics on how that's going to manifest in a human life, right? So I could see that some people could interpret it further to say like, oh, well then, yeah, then like maybe like this could change in time, right? But I think that's also kind of speaking outside the text and speaking outside of the tradition to some extent, right? Because that's just not there in that way. But, at the same time, I do think that, like, if I'm going to talk about freedom or I'm going to talk about healing, it's going to be maybe less about tendency and more about behavior, right? Like, I hope that people have freedom from compulsive sexual behavior. I really do. Right? And I think that is something that like we can hope for and we can work towards in a life of virtue, right? And to have freedom to choose the Lord, right? Freedom to choose what is good and holy and right. And if we are, and I think God wants us to be free from being like dominated by passions that are going to lead us to sin. But that doesn't mean that those will like disappear or go away. And I don't think there's really anything. You could like kind of proof text. You could obviously say like, oh, well, look what Jesus did for the blind man or something, right? You can kind of like proof text it from scripture, but that's not. That's no offense. That's like not what Catholics do. Like no, that just like you can't just like pick one thing and be like, this means this is what God is doing in every and all situation, right? And so, so I kind of
we have entire deaf churches,
Right, exactly, and then it does, right? I think that gets into like that line of thinking. I think gets into a different kind of slippery slope, right? Of like. So then what happens? Are you not praying hard enough? Like, why are you still deaf? Why do you still have cancer? Like, did you rob the cross of its power? Right? Like, by not believing your cancer could be cured? Like, we just get into a slippery slope, I think, with those things. And I also think, too, it in a certain sense, I think what robs the cross of its power is not believing in redemptive suffering, actually. Like, that's actually, I think, more something that we see in both scripture and in sacred tradition as a recurring theme, right? That certain things are just going to be with us. And sometimes like that's what God has for us, right? And that doesn't mean it won't shift. I've noticed different ways my desires have shifted or like my type has shifted or ways my attraction has like been in flux in different ways in my life. But yeah, I wonder if we're going after something that maybe we don't need to be okay.
Well, and I think that it can rob it of, in some ways, seeing it as like a trailhead to point to encounter with the Lord, right? Like seeing your desires as an opportunity or a trailhead to point to like, where are these desires ultimately leading, right? To your original piece about St. Thomas of Aquinas, that like, how can it be a trailhead to the divine? Go ahead.
Right, because this goes back to the kind of the eschatological framework, we'd say like going towards the eschaton, right? Like this idea of like, there's no marrying and giving in marriage in heaven, right? Going towards the end game for every human soul, right? Like at the end of the day, like desire for heterosexual sex is not actually God's end game for the human heart. It's not, like that, because that's actually not what's going to happen in heaven. I'm sorry. Well, not sorry, whatever, but.
So, like, how do you, like, think about change specifically? Because different people have conversations on, like, what change or, healing is.
I think sometimes it can be kind of this, like, war, right? Between change or no change when it comes to sexuality. And I think that's kind of like this like weird false dichotomy, right? Like I think there is a reality of like, yeah, if you're like switching up your habits and you've got grace on your side, like I hope when you're 34, your arousal isn't triggering the same way it did when you were 14. Like I really hope that for you. And is that a form of change? Yes, like, oh, maybe I'm not like triggered by this as readily, or maybe there were things that were really problematic for me and I couldn't watch and just drove me to lust at this point in my life, and now I can watch that and it doesn't affect me in the same way, right? Or like, do I have compulsive sexual behaviors like to masturbation or to with another or hookup apps or whatever? Like I hope you can grow in freedom from just feeling like you need to do that, right? To be fulfilled or to find release, right? And those things are changes. They are, and can those changes be affected, I think, by our relationship with the Lord and by grace? Yes, I think grace is very real in those places. At the same time, like when I think change can also kind of become this idol, which can be problematic, right?
Because in our timelines.
Right. And I think too, this reality, and I mentioned this, that in heaven, right, there's no marrying or giving in marriage. There's no sex. There's not going to be a sexual arousal the way we experience it now, right, of any kind, heterosexual or homosexual. There will, however, be perfect union with the Godhead, who is the perfection of both masculinity and femininity. So I, as a woman, will be perfectly united to the eternal feminine in heaven. I will be perfectly united to the perfection of the eternal masculine. Like I would prefer to have my hope be in that, and then like live my day-to-day life charitably in my relationships. And yeah, if there's areas of wounds, if there's areas of brokenness, if there's areas that I treat other people that are rooted in like messed up shit that happened in my past or choices I make, like I should deal with those things, right? Because that's dealing with those things helps you be holy. But like having an objective in mind with that, like, oh, if I do that, then this is going to shift in me. Maybe not necessarily, And so I think kind of holding out like, well, I need to go back and I need to fix stuff, or I need to let God fix this thing in me or heal this thing in me so that I can be more heterosexual than I was yesterday. I think that's like actually like, in a certain sense, not going far enough. Right? Yeah. Like, and that can sound kind of weird, but like, because actually the end goal again is this union with God in heaven. And so if my hope is an earthly heterosexuality, I'm missing the mark. Like I'm actually not going far enough. My eyes should be fixed on him. And it is entirely possible that this persists in me until the day that I die, right? Like all of the evidence points towards inclinations to sin persisting until the day that we die. Who am I to pick and choose which ones those are inside of me, right? Like if we think of what Jesus said to Paul, right? Like this thorn in his side that he Paul's like begs him to take it away, and Jesus like, nope, this is the means by which I'm drawing you to myself. And if that for me is my like sexuality, then like that's where my fiat needs to go. And I need to be okay with that.
That's helpful. Especially,
that's my hot take.
But we love your hot take, or at least I do. It's helpful, especially as we're kind of in an arc these days of engaging this concept of healing in relationship to same-sex attraction or all the variants thereof. So we appreciate your thoughts. Thank you for sharing. Can I go back to a language question, kind of? and this is an entry point to a different question. You guys use gender discordance or gender disconnect in talking, I think, about what a lot of other people call trans experiences or gender dysphoria. So I'm both curious about why you guys are employing this language, but also how have you been engaging gender disconnect or gender discordance in Eden Invitation specifically?
Yeah, so early on, we made the choice not to use dysphoria because it's connected to, like a clinical designation by the APA, right? And frankly, a lot of people could feel like not at home within their biological sex and not have all the markers or not get a diagnosis or something, you know what I mean? And so we wanted to kind of separate it from that clinical reality or that clinical description and more focus on the spectrum of experiences. And then, so I just said gender discordance. I was like, oh, there's a discord. Oh, discordance. Sure. Let's say that. Like that was a little arbitrary. But then once we had more people involved in Eden Invitation, that this was part of their experience, a lot of them also liked the phrase disconnect, like they feel a disconnect. And so that's why we use both of those. And I guess I don't like intentionally avoid trans, right, per se, but I've found, at least in the people that we're serving, they're not necessarily gravitating towards that term. And I think, again, because it's unlike maybe like gay or lesbian or bisexual, which are like pretty clear cut, right? It's like, you're exclusively attracted. Like, I think the trans term can be applied in a wide variety of ways. And so it doesn't seem like something that's totally resonated with our community members. But if someone wanted to say, oh, I have a trans experience, I don't think you would mind. No.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. I was going to ask, has that been an emerging part of your work, or was that from the very beginning, like gender discordance?
Yeah, well, I think at the beginning, we started out, I think just because the witness and the founders of Eden Invitation was people who experienced same-sex desires, that we drew in people with that experience at the majority at first.
And that's what we talked about more explicitly.
And we didn't want to speak out of, I was going to say, we did not want to speak out of an experience that was not our own as an authority in any way. That just wasn't appropriate. And so we started to find people who really resonated with some of our values and our language, who experienced gender discordance. And I think that's been a growing population more and more. You can speak more to it since I know you've worked more directly, if you want. But yeah, we've just seen a growing need to have dialogue and community around it as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think some people will say, oh, it's so different, from like same-sex attraction, right? It's so different, like we can't do both. And I think for us, because we're coming at it of a framework, we're not just talking about sexuality. Like we've always been trying to like pan the camera back and be like, what does it mean to be a human being, like in relation to God and in relation to others? And how is it that our like embodiment and our sexuality like intersects with that? And so we always have talked about it from that perspective. So I think, to Shannon's point, there were people wrestling with gender that resonated. And so we just like kind of keep doing that. We are, I think working on it though, right? Because I think there are some clearer boundaries maybe. I mean, people argue about what's gray, I think, within sexuality, right?
Sure.
What language should we use? Are celibate partnerships okay, right? There's obviously like some areas that people fight over, but I think there is a clearer path of like what to do, what not to do. There's some clear boundaries. But I feel like when it comes to gender, that's less clear. And even within the Catholic tradition, which tends to have lots of rules about everything, there's not actually a lot of like authoritative rules about this. And besides surgery, right? That there would be anything that like kind of destroys the reproductive capacity would not be okay, right? That'd be a violation of bodily integrity.
And there are policies for schools, but not pastoral direction.
Yes, that's
for people
true. You
who
could
experience.
If you Google it, you'll find like school policies. But again, that is not the same as like our high authorities being like, here's what to do, you guys. And that usually ends up coming from bottom-up theology anyway. Like people on our level like think about it and talk about it, and then in 20 years the church will be like, well, we like that but not that, so this is what we're doing. So we're doing some work within our own community, people who experience gender disconnect, people with some kind of advanced theology degrees, and trying to wrestle through like, okay, we don't always have these specific answers from the church, but like, what do we want to do? Like, what do we want to invite people to, and how do we see that being rooted and grounded in existing teaching. So that's, kind of a work in progress for us right now. Won't be done for a few more months. Yeah, I think we're very open to people with those experiences being part of Eden Invitation. There's a pretty dynamic kind of sub-community, subgroup of people. Yeah, and also, too, I think even beyond gender, we've had, people with intersex conditions reach out. We've had people experiencing asexuality become really dynamic parts of our community as well. So just, keeping the acronym open.
Speaking of acronym, how would you engage with Pride as either ministry or
So, yeah, we always engage it, at least in kind of a general way. Usually we pick like a theme for the month. And then we've done a bunch of different types of things. We've had blog series, we've done drop-in conversations, small groups. I think because it's just such a time for a lot of mixed emotions within our community and in the wider world. And so we try to have some kind of outlet for people. We also, get a ton of media requests and stuff.
And I think, too, we try to put stuff out there for ourselves as an organization, try to put stuff out there that, again, kind of takes the air out of it. I know that seems to be a theme, or kind of disarm people in a way, because people get caught in the crossfire of the culture war during June, and we're just trying to protect people from the shrapnel. And so I think oftentimes, you'll see blogs or conversations about what does God promise to me? What are his invitations, right? When people try to weaponize the rainbow and they're like, no, what people have hijacked this. And it's okay, well, if that's going to be part of the conversation, let's actually look at if that's a symbol of promise, what kind of promises does God speak over us? And how does that actually apply to you, queer person who's sitting there wondering if God loves you? Or even to just what, within this secular pride space, there's a lot of a sense of just pride comes from being some of this history passed down, and that you can be more open about your experience now. So we did a whole series on inheritance. What do we inherit from the Lord, from our churches, from our families, from the wider LGBTQ community? And what can that teach us about how we can relate to the Lord, to our communities? So that's kind of our approach with that, is we don't really want to engage the culture war Christian space or the wider secular space on it directly. We want to be here, people getting hit in the middle. Let's make a safe home for you to process amidst it all.
And I feel that's, something we do. That's an attitude we have all year long. I mean, I don't think I think we're very intentional to avoid, being reactive, going tit for tat with people. I'm just not interested in that, I think, or being buzzy or that kind of a thing. I'm just a lot more interested in the people and making sure that people are cared for. That's really the focus that we try to have.
So maybe another transition to a different topic. What kind? This is more kind of maybe future oriented sort of questions, or maybe present and future. What sort of new lines of inquiry or thought or practice around sexuality have you guys been seeing as valuable in current times? Might be in the Catholic Church, might be outside of it. What has been something new that's emerging that excites you for the conversation?
I mean, the first thing I'll say is just to briefly re-echo, I think the gender conversation, right? And really kind of looking at okay, what, I think you could look at that gigantic gray area as something scary, as let's hurry up and figure something out. But I look at it as something kind of really exciting. Oh, wait, there's a lot of opportunity here to really revisit kind of the core of what does it mean to be human? What does it mean to be male or female? Have we gotten bogged down or lost in stereotypes? What's at the heart of this? And how do we be creative from the heart of that place? So I think that's something I'm excited. I mean, we're doing an invitation. I also see a couple pockets of different thinkers that are starting to do that as well, that are just, I think that's one exciting thing to me. I'll keep thinking of more.
I think something that intrigues me that I feel like it's more secular that I noticed a couple of years ago was kind of the movement of like love has no label, and actually some deconstruction of language secularly, I think has been really fascinating in the sense of just observing, again, more secularly, people trying to sit with like, what is the important, like, what is the value of language? Like and trying to wrestle, I think, with it on a more meta level. In the sense of like, I think that's what's intrigued me too, is just seeing some of the secular wrestling with like, okay, what language do I use to describe my experience? Do I use language? Do I need to like, or do I just like say I have feelings for this person? You know, like, I think that's been a really fascinating piece, is almost kind of in a sense of movement towards like personalism and like just like a personal self-description and relating to other people that actually doesn't have a particular definition. And I just think that's fascinating to some of the point of just like encountering the Lord, like who is like the fullness of like the divine, feminine and masculine, just that sense of like, that there's almost like this like transcendent wrestling and in a secular level around describing experience. And I think that to me has been really fascinating to watch.
Kind of as we move towards, as we wrap up, I think, where do you find hope for the conversation in the Catholic Church around faith and sexuality particularly? And then also as a second question, what barriers do you continue to see in the Catholic Church around these topics?
I think I have a lot of hope that I think there's a lot of people open to an expanded conversation, right? I think people seeing like, wow, like we're just like bleeding out LGBTQ kids, you know, and like this, or gosh, the way I handled this with my child or my brother, like went really badly, you know, like I got to think about this. Like I got to think about the way I relate differently. And so I do see a lot of openness and yeah, and I just think I think that's just really cool.
Yeah, I feel like,
I'll just say at all levels, right?
Yeah.
Like, I mean, I talk to like random moms, I talk to bishops, like everyone in between, you know, like I think there's a lot of different ways, like, yeah, at all levels, all different areas.
Rallying, yeah. I feel like there's like a rallying of like allies, so to speak, in that sense. But also too, I think something where I've been finding a lot of hope is just the rising up of people with LGBT plus experiences in the Catholic Church, like leaning into that side B space of like, I mean, I even think of people who've like come to Eat an Invitation, and somebody who started with a pseudonym, didn't want to be known or associated, and like now they've like given talks, you know,
Wow.
like at a school, you know, different things like that. And I think that to me is where I find a lot of hope is, you know, at first when we started Eat an Invitation, I think we felt some isolation. And I think one of the other hopes, I think, for Eat an Invitation is that, you know, our third mission movement is to empower for creative discipleship. And I think to know that like we're helping cultivate some of the community space where people can feel safe to come to know themselves and hopefully feel called on to mission. And maybe that mission is like something totally different, or maybe some of it is like speaking up in the context of LGBT plus issues and bearing witness to like a vibrant life in the church, you know?
Well, and even on that openness point, you know, I think when we first started Eat an Invitation, we were ultra concerned with confidentiality, and we still are, right? A lot of people need a high level of confidentiality. But this retreat where we took a page out of Revoice's book and are having like lanyards based on how okay you are being photographed and put into marketing materials. Because initially we were like, we can never take pictures on retreat because everyone's so closeted, you know? So this year we're like, okay, let's do this lanyard thing. And at least half.
Yeah, there's a large percentage that's comfortable being photographed, which is a huge jump.
Yeah. I would have never imagined that 5 years ago.
No.
But it's like, we have almost like more people comfortable with this than not, you know? And that's really, really exciting.
Yeah. And obviously there's reasons people want maximum privacy with that, but like,
100%.
just that sense that, just the beautiful sense of like people wanting to like, be comfortable and let their life be a witness.
Right.
More publicly.
Prudence is always important,
Yes.
but it feels like there's a decrease in fear,
Yeah.
like fear-based reasons, you know? Yeah. Barriers. You know, I think something I've seen, at least in the American Catholic Church, that's mostly what I can speak to, is I feel like I see a lot of people who want to like interpret the church, and then they come across with an authority that they don't have, right? Like there's kind of this like influencer Catholicism right now. I don't know if that's the right word for it, but like, you know, I just think it's interesting because I think Catholics are really concerned about like authority and like having the right answers and who's the right person to tell me the right thing so I can like understand it. And I think there's a lot of people, and I think that can be challenging around sexuality when you have a lot of different voices and people that are interpreting, like we kind of heard this talked about today, right? That there's like kind of these two different perspectives, and there's even more than two, right? In different ways. But people who are like, yeah, I love the church, I'm devout, I believe it all. But then we like extrapolate differently. And I think it's problematic when our extrapolation becomes authoritative, right? Or we act like our extrapolation is authoritative, right? Like there are things even that I said today, like my connection to like the mystical tradition, that's an extrapolation, right? Like there might be people that is not helpful for. And if it is not helpful, don't read it. Like that's fine, you know, like I don't care. Like please don't, like if you don't find that helpful for you. But I get concerned when there's these extrapolations that happen that then people take, oh, my extrapolation is now prescriptive for everyone, right? And so I think that can be a barrier because it confuses people. It confuses people about like, what does the church really say? What does Christ really say here? Because I'm hearing these different voices that all claim to be good Catholics, you know?
And I think
we just need a little more clarity on like, okay, like what is doctrine and what is someone's extrapolation that's valuable for them and other people may find to be valuable, but isn't necessarily required for everybody.
And I think there's just like great care and prudence that needs to be taken, especially in this area, because people with an LGBT plus experience, I think, are just really vulnerable in the sense that like you're looking for answers and you're looking for direction. And sometimes, like, I fell into that, like in my early days of my faith, of grasping for answers. So I went to wherever I thought was best, you know, in that sense. And I think like fell into some really challenging ideology that was not healthy for me because of this like weird authority thing.
And that can have some major mental health consequences.
Yes. And so I think there's just, with that authority piece, I think I think sometimes people can speak with this authority without some of that prudence and care, very, very careful care of how some of that will be like received. And there needs to be a lot of prudence.
I believe that. Well, I wanted to thank you guys so much. It was great to talk with you. We really appreciated hearing all your thoughts.
I both love the emphasis y'all have on kind of like, you know, Garden to the New Jerusalem, of like the invitation into Eden and back to our roots. But you also have that heavenly vision of just like what are the mysteries and wonders and intimacy that Jesus is inviting us into, and that you guys are doing that in community. I think is just really, really great. And just to make sure it's clear for our listeners, Eden Invitation is open to Protestants and Catholics and Orthodox. And so, like, what's the easiest way for someone to get looped into the community?
Somebody can reach out to edeninvitation.com. Specifically, if you're looking to get connected with community, we have a community page under our How to Get Connected tab. And when you reach out, you'll get to chat with someone one-on-one, share your story, and we can tell you a little bit more about Eden Invitation, just as a way to encounter relationship and the incarnation, to know you're not alone. And then, too, from there, there's ways to get connected through our retreats, our online book clubs as little small groups, and then even the local manifestation of Eden Invitation in our hearth groups, where people gather together in prayer and fellowship consistently. So you can find us also on social media.
Nice.
Instagram.
Yeah, we'll share
I was
share
going to
those
say.
links in the show notes. So.
Instagram, Facebook.
And no matter your sexuality, if you believe that this is an important mission in the world today and in our churches today, we are a 501c3 nonprofit, and we're always looking for more monthly mission partners.
With
Do it.
part of that, just a quick note. I mean, that's that justice issue is we try to keep everything free or low cost to our community members because we feel like it's a justice issue that there needs to be a pastoral response where people can access.
Yep, and our community, all of our community-facing staff has an LGBTQ plus experience. We want to provide health care to our employees and just have, good benefits and all that. And so we want to, so we're just trying to, find ways to make sure people are taken care of, and that costs money. So if you want to support us in that way, you can go to eatinvitation.com/donate.
Awesome. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thank you for coming on
This
again.
has been great.
And thank you, listeners, if you've made it all the way through the episode. We hope that it was delightful for you and that you go check out the good work of Eden Invitation. So, may the Lord bless you two, Anna and Shannon, and the work of EI, and Lord bless all y'all listeners. Adios. Hey, listeners, I want to let you know about the Communion and Shalom Patreon. Joining the Patreon community not only supports this podcast, but gives you the opportunity to listen to bonus content, give input on future episodes, and submit questions for a patron-only Q&A. We're so thankful for the support and encouragement from so many listeners, and we hope that this podcast continues to be meaningful to you.